Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into something really fundamental, a concept that explains so much about why big powers compete, even when maybe they just want to be safe.
Yeah, we're focusing on Diplomacy and International Relations by Bastian Freiburg, and specifically the security dilemma.
It sounds academic, but it's core to understanding international politics.
Absolutely. It's often called the central tragedy of it all. It's this idea that nations just trying to ensure their own safety can actually end up making everyone less safe, potentially leading to conflict.
Okay, so our mission today, we want to unpack the theory behind it, the foundations.
And then see how this dilemma actually plays out in some of the world's critical hotspots right now.
Right. So let's start at the beginning. Where does this idea even come from? It seems to link back to, well, the structure of international relations itself.
It does. It all starts with anarchy. And we need to be clear, like you said, this isn't chaos in the streets.
No, it's the political science term, meaning there's no world government, right?
Mhm.
No global 911 to call if another state attacks you.
Precisely. There's no supranational authority to enforce rules or protect states. And because of that anarchy, every state has to look out for itself. It's a self-help system.
Okay, self-help. And that drives this feeling of insecurity.
It drives the need to prepare for the worst, mainly because of uncertainty over intentions. You just can't be 100% sure that another state's military buildup is purely defensive.
Even if they say it is.
Even if they genuinely believe it is. You see your neighbor building up arms, you think, well, maybe that's aimed at me, so you build up yours in response.
Which sounds like the definition John Herz gave us. He described it as this situation where groups living side by side without a higher power are constantly worried about being attacked or even destroyed.
That's the one. It's a structural condition. And the paradox, the real kicker, is that rational steps taken for defense.
End up looking threatening to others.
Exactly. State A boosts its security. State B sees this, feels threatened, and reacts with its own military measures. Now State A feels less secure than before it started. It's an action-reaction spiral.
Leading to what Herz called those unintended tragic results. It's a cycle fueled purely by defensive motives, potentially.
Potentially, yes. Driven by that inescapable uncertainty and lack of trust inherent in the anarchic system.
Okay, that makes sense as a core mechanism.
Yeah. And listen, before we dive into the real-world examples, just a quick note for you listening. If you're finding this deep dive useful, you can actually help us keep the lights on and get access to extra episodes, too.
That's right. You can subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It's a small monthly fee, and the link is right there in the description. It really helps us continue making these deep dives.
It really does. Okay, so where do we see the security dilemma playing out today?
Well, a really prominent example, especially from a Western perspective, has to be NATO expansion after the Cold War and Russia's reaction.
Oh, definitely. Let's trace that. Post-Cold War, NATO brought in former Warsaw Pact members. You had Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic in '99.
Then the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, others in 2004.
Right. And from NATO's viewpoint, this was about expanding the zone of democracy, stability, collective defense, benign intentions, essentially.
But the security dilemma tells us intentions aren't always what matter most. It's the perception of the action. So how did Moscow view this eastward expansion?
Well, they didn't see it as benign. The perception, certainly intensifying over time, was one of encirclement, a strategic move by a rival alliance pushing right up to its borders, shrinking its traditional sphere of influence.
And this is where thinkers like John Mearsheimer come in. He's argued this quite forcefully.
Yes, Mearsheimer. Drawing from offensive realism, the idea that states maximize power for survival argues that NATO expansion was inherently provocative. Especially the talk, remember the 2008 Bucharest summit?
Where they declared Ukraine and Georgia would eventually become members.
Exactly. For Mearsheimer, that crossed a red line. It wasn't just abstract enlargement anymore. It was pushing into areas Russia considers vital to its security. He argues this directly provoked deep Russian insecurities,
Fueling countermeasures and, ultimately, contributing to conflict. It's a strong structural argument. Geography and power trump stated intentions.
It really emphasizes how actions, even if intended defensively or democratically, are interpreted through a power lens by potential rivals. The expansion itself created the conditions for friction.
But wait, some might ask, NATO expanded earlier under different Russian leaders, perhaps with less overt hostility initially. Does that challenge the purely structural view?
That's a fair point. The intensity of the reaction certainly depends on the specific regime, its perceptions, its goals. But the argument from the source material leans towards the structural pressure being constant.
Meaning the expansion itself, pushing the alliance closer, fundamentally altered the strategic environment in a way that sooner or later was likely to trigger a security dilemma reaction from Moscow, regardless of who was in charge.
Pretty much. The West sought security, but the means-chosen alliance expansion inadvertently ramped up insecurity for Russia, leading to the very militarization it hoped to prevent. A classic, tragic outcome.
And this isn't just a Europe thing. We see similar dynamics, maybe even more complex ones, playing out in the Pacific, right,
Yeah.
between the U.S. and China.
Absolutely. The South China Sea is another textbook case, really. It started, with overlapping territorial claims. China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Taiwan all have stakes there.
But it seems to have escalated beyond just who owns which reef.
It really did, especially after the Scarborough Shoal incident back in 2012. That seemed to mark a shift. It became less about specific islands and more about the regional order itself, a broader strategic competition.
Which then kicks off that action-reaction arms spiral we talked about.
Precisely. China builds up its naval forces, develops missiles capabilities seen by others as offensive or coercive.
And the response. The U.S., Japan, Taiwan, others develop their own capabilities, often framed as defensive anti-coercion systems. But each move just raises the stakes.
Every upgrade on one side is read by the other as making them less safe. And this creates a really sharp problem when it comes to deterrence, particularly around Taiwan.
Ah, yes, the tightrope walk. How does the U.S. signal enough commitment to deter an attack on Taiwan?
Without signaling so much commitment, maybe seeming like it's backing full independence, that it actually provokes Beijing into thinking they have to act now before it's too late.
That's the dilemma in a nutshell for policymakers, isn't it? Be tough, but not too tough.
Yeah.
Because if Beijing perceives an unconditional U.S. commitment or Taiwan moving definitively toward independence,
It could make them feel cornered, making a preemptive use of force more likely, not less. The rational act of strengthening deterrence could paradoxically trigger the conflict it aims to prevent.
wow. So whether it's Moscow or Beijing, the search for security by one side seems to inherently breed insecurity for the other.
That's the relentless logic. But it does raise the question, why does this feel sharper, maybe more dangerous in some situations than others? What dials the dilemma up or down?
Okay, so now we're getting into the theoretical gears behind the dilemma, like the offense-defense balance.
Exactly. This is a key variable. It asks, does military technology and strategy at a given time favor the attacker or the defender? And crucially, can you even tell the difference between offensive and defensive weapons?
Right. If offensive capabilities are dominant think tanks rolling across borders easily, quick, decisive wars, the argument is that war is more likely.
Yeah, because there's a huge incentive to strike first before the other side can mobilize. Some historians argue this was the case in the run-up to World War I, maybe that period from 1815 to 1913. Offense seemed easier.
And conversely, if defense has the advantage, think trenches, fortifications, long wars of attrition where attackers suffer huge losses.
Then war should be less likely, or at least the security dilemma should be less severe, because launching an attack is just too costly and uncertain. You can afford to wait and see.
But the source material threw a curveball here, didn't it? Mentioning the period from, 1648 to 1789, often seen as defense-dominant with all the siege warfare.
Yes. That period actually saw more frequent wars than the later offense-dominant era, which is counterintuitive.
So what explains that?
Well, the thinking is, while tactical defense was strong, taking fortresses was hard, the political landscape was different. Lots of smaller states, personalized rule. Maybe war was just politically easier and cheaper to start, even if winning was hard.
Ah, so the purely technological balance isn't the whole story. Political factors can override it.
Definitely. It shows these structural forces interact with other things, which leads us to the biggest structure of all, the overall polarity of the international system.
Meaning the number of great powers. Bipolar, multipolar.
Right. International politics is usually seen as a small number system, only a few truly great powers at any time. And the argument, a famous one, is that bipolar systems tend to be more stable.
Like the U.S. and the USSR during the Cold War.
Exactly. And the link to the security dilemma is direct. In a bipolar world, your main rival is crystal clear. There's less uncertainty about who the threat is.
So actions and reactions are more direct. If the Soviets did something, the U.S. reacted, and vice versa. High tension, maybe, but less room for miscalculation about who's doing what to whom.
Precisely. The pressure to manage the relationship carefully is immense because any major conflict involves the other superpower directly. Now, contrast that with a multipolar system, three or more great powers, like Europe before World War I.
Okay, so what happens to the security dilemma then?
It gets way worse. The uncertainty skyrockets. Who are alliances aimed at? If State A builds up its navy, is that aimed at State B or State C or both?
Responsibilities get diffused, calculations become harder.
Yes. States might gamble, thinking they can make a move and the other powers won't unite against them. Or they might misinterpret another state's defensive move because it's unclear who it's defending against. This complexity sharpens the core problem uncertainty, making the system much less stable.
So the structure itself, bipolarity versus multipolarity, fundamentally changes how acutely the security dilemma is felt.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've established this dilemma is pretty much baked into the system. It's this tragic logic. What can policymakers actually do about it? Can we escape it?
The source material suggests, maybe not escape, but navigate it more skillfully. Mitigation, not elimination.
Right. And a key part of that is strategic communication. It starts with recognizing that the state you perceive as threatening might just be acting out of its own defensive concerns. It requires trying to understand their perspective.
So talking is important, diplomacy.
Okay.
But just saying we're peaceful isn't enough, is it, given the inherent mistrust?
No, words are cheap. Assurance needs to come through substantive measures, things you can actually see and verify.
Like what, for example?
Things like the type of weapons you build and where you put them. Are you building weapons clearly designed for defense or for long-range power projection? Are your forces deployed right on the border or further back?
Okay, so force posture, deployment patterns, things that signal defensive intent through actions, not just words. Maybe even inviting observers to military exercises.
Exactly. Transparency measures that demonstrate your military doctrine is defensive. These visible actions can help build a sliver of trust, or at least reduce misperceptions.
And then, looking longer term, there's this idea of moving beyond the dilemma altogether, towards what Carl Deutsch called security communities.
Yeah, that's sort of the aspirational endgame. A security community isn't just an alliance against a common enemy. It's a group of states, often democracies, that develop such deep cooperation, shared values, and crucially, mutual identification.
That they genuinely develop, as Deutsch put it, dependable expectations of peaceful change. They simply stop thinking about fighting each other.
Right. Think maybe Scandinavia or North America. War between Canada and the U.S. is essentially unthinkable now. They've moved beyond the self-help logic internally. Trust has replaced the security dilemma, at least within that community.
So it is possible, just very difficult to achieve on a wider scale.
Extremely difficult, especially between major powers with conflicting interests and different political systems.
So wrapping this up then, the big takeaway seems to be that international relations isn't necessarily zero-sum, but the anarchic structure pushes states towards self-help.
Which automatically limits cooperation and fuels that competitive dynamic, driving the security dilemma, even among states that might prefer peace.
It's a powerful, if somewhat pessimistic, view of how the world works.
It certainly highlights the constraints that the international system itself places on state behavior.
Which leads us nicely to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider. If this anarchic structure really forces states into this competitive, security-seeking behavior, does that mean explanations for conflict that focus only on a state's internal makeup, like its ideology or its economic system or its leader's personality, are missing the point?
You mean, are those reductionist theories insufficient because they ignore the external systemic pressures?
Exactly. Should we, therefore, always start by looking for these structural security dilemma-type explanations when we try to understand why nations clash?
That's a huge question about how we analyze international politics, something definitely worth mulling over.
Indeed. Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive into the security dilemma. A massive thank you for joining us.
We hope this framework gives you a useful lens for looking at global events.
Absolutely. If you found this discussion valuable, please do follow the show on whatever platform you're using. And if you could rate us 5 stars, that really helps get these deep dives out to more people.
Thanks so much for listening.